Hello everyone, my name is Jake and today I want to show you how to add a bit of variation to your terrains. To do this, we're going to create our own custom HDRP terrainlet shader and add something called macro variations. To give you an example of what that might look like, here I have a scene with a pretty bland looking terrain, and just by adjusting this macro intensity up a little bit, you'll see that we've added a little bit more variation to the terrain to make it a little bit more interesting. So let's go ahead and get started on creating these shaders. Let's get started by creating our shader folder and adding in the terrainlet shaders. So let's go ahead and create this folder, name it shaders. And then we'll want to copy our HDRP default terrainlet shaders from the packages folder. So let's go and find that. They're located in packages under HDR, high definition RP, runtime, material, terrainlet. Okay. Here you'll find all of the terrain shaders that we'll need. So go ahead and copy them, Control C, and paste them in your own assets folder. If you get this error, that's because we've accidentally copied this terrainlet API. We don't want to do that, so if you've done that like I have, go ahead and delete it. Alright, let's go ahead and open all of these shaders up into our code editor so that they're easier to work with. So the first thing we're going to want to do is replace some of the include paths. Because you've copied the shader from the packages folder, the shaders will be referencing includes from the packages folder. What we want to do is go through all of these shaders that we have open here and find and replace everything from packages to terrainlet / replace that with a empty string, and we'll want to do it to all open documents. This is the reason why I had you open up all of the shader files. Let's go ahead and do that. It should have replaced 51 occurrences. Click OK, and we'll go ahead and save that for every single file that was changed. And once that's done, let's go ahead and change the shader name from either hidden or blank like this to custom HDRP. Let's go ahead and go through all of our shaders and make sure that that's changed. Finally, to prep our shader for this, we'll go ahead and go back to our terrainlet shader, scroll down to the bottom, and swap out the dependency basemap shader and basemap gen shader from the hidden version to our custom version, like that. Okay, go ahead and save, and let's return back to Unity. Inside of Unity, you will notice, well, you should notice that there hasn't been any changes, and that's because we haven't applied our new shader to the terrain. So let's go ahead and do that now. We do that, we'll go ahead and create a folder called materials. Create a material. Inside that folder, we'll call it m_terrain, and then we'll assign our custom terrainlet to this shader, or to this material, like so. Cool. And then in our terrain object, under the terrain settings, we'll want to replace this material from the default to our custom terrain. Back in Visual Studio, what we're going to do is in our terrainlet shader, we're going to go ahead and add some of the properties that we'll need. And we'll do that here in the properties section of our shader at the bottom. We're going to want to add a macro variant texture so that we can reference this texture as our sort of noise texture. We'll call that macro variant texture 2D, and by default we'll make it gray. We'll also want a set of scale values so that we can add a little bit more variation with this variant texture. In my code, I've got 3 different scales. I have a large, medium, and small scale. So let's go ahead and add those. We'll call them macro layer scale. The first one will be 0. These will be of the type of a float, and by default we'll go ahead and give this a value of 50. For our next one, we'll name it macro layer scale 1. Make sure I spell that right. Give it a name. And this will also be a float with a default value of 25. And then finally, we'll go and add a third scale, macro layer scale 2. Give it a label. Also, again, as a type float, and we'll default that to value 10. And for our final property, we're going to want to add an intensity so you can control how much of the macro variant is being displayed on your texture or on your terrain. So let's go ahead and add that macro intensity and give it a label. This will be, we'll have this as a range from 0 to 1. So let's go ahead and do that, 0 to 1. And we'll default that to 0.5. Okay. Let's go ahead and save, make sure that there are no errors. Cool. And back to our terrain shader. So in order to use these variables, we're going to have to reference them in our actual CG shader. To do that, let's move over to the terrainlit splatmap.HLSL script. This is where all the magic happens. So in here, we're going to want to, like I said, reference our variable or our properties by creating a few variables here at the top. Underneath your sampler value here, we'll go ahead and add our 5 references. So the first one we're going to reference will be our texture. So texture 2D. We called it macro variant texture. Then we'll add a float for our 3 scales, floats for our 3 scales, macro layer scale 0, float macro layer scale 1, float macro layer scale 2. And then finally we'll add our float for the macro intensity. Cool. Now let's go ahead and save that. Again, just double check, make sure we don't have any errors. And we do. So let's take a look at what that is. It says there's an unexpected float in our shader, and that's because I've forgotten to put a semicolon. Save that. And now we're good. Okay, so once we're good with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to the meat of the tutorial, which is creating our function to apply the macro variation. So just below these, we'll add a new function. It's going to be a void. We'll call it terrain, apply macro variation. It's going to take in 2 parameters, a float2 UV and an in-out terrain lit surface data type. This terrain lit surface data is the struct that Unity uses within the shader to pass around the albedo, all the different values that they use to apply the shader. You can actually find this terrain lit surface data struct in the includes, I think, let's see here, in the terrain lit surface data HLSL, and you'll see here this is where it's declared, and these are all the values that it has. Okay, so let's go back to our slat map HLSL. Inside this function, we're going to do the macro variant magic. So the first thing we're going to do is sample our texture at 3 different scales sample our macro variant texture at 3 different scales. And to do that, we'll go ahead and declare a float called macro A, and we'll sample the texture 2D macro variant texture. We'll borrow a sampler that Unity has already created up here called sampler splat 0. And then we'll use our UV that we've passed in multiplied by the macro layer scale 0. Okay. So now that we've sampled this, the way I have this set up is that you can actually put in different grayscale values for each channel in your RGB and use those for the different layers of your, or different scales of your macro variant. So we'll want to pull, since this is a float, the value from each one of the RGB channels. So for this one, we'll go ahead and pull it from the R. And then to brighten this up a little bit, we'll add an offset of 0.5. Okay, let's go ahead and do this again, copy and paste for the next 3 scales. So we'll call them macro B, scale the second scale, and then we'll use the G channel, and then finally macro C with the scale of macro layer scale 2 and the blue channel. Cool. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and blend all these together by multiplying them together, and then using our macro intensity, we'll linearly interpolate from 1.0 to this value, because we're going to end up at the end of this function multiplying it by our albedo. Obviously, if you multiply albedo by 1.0, nothing will change. So that's how we're going to control our intensity. So let's go ahead and set that up here. Float final blend will be equal to lerp 1.0 macro A times macro B times macro C. And then we'll interpolate that by the macro intensity. And then finally, we'll apply it to our surface data, the albedo of that, by multiplying it with our final blend. Go ahead and save that. Let's return back to Unity, make sure we don't have any errors. Looks good. Okay, now in order to apply our macro variation, we want to go ahead and call this function below. So let's go ahead and copy it. And we'll want to call it within our within the terrain splat blend function that they have here, near the bottom, right after we've applied our albedo layers. So right here in between smoothness and the loop that applies to albedos. We'll go ahead and call this. For our UV, we're going to want to pass in, borrow the control UV that they've passed in here into our function. So let's go ahead and pass that. And then finally, we're going to want to pass in the surface data struct and semicolon. Let's go ahead and save that, and we should see when we return back to Unity a little bit of a difference. Okay, if you noticed, it gotten a little bit darker. Let's go ahead and apply our first variation so we can see the fruits of our labor. So go to your materials, m_terrain. You'll see now we have all of our options that we've set up here. I have a few variants prepared already, so let's go and grab that. This one here is actually I borrowed the Dota grass texture and made it into a grayscale, so we'll go ahead and use that. I think that looks really nice. Obviously, if you're going to be creating this for production, you're going to want to create your own sort of grunge texture like this. But for this, let's go ahead and add that. Boom. So now you'll see that our terrain has a little bit of variation. You can control its intensity with the slider here. And this is great for if you have sort of repeating textures that you want to break up, or even with my example here where it's just kind of a boring sort of texture that you want to break up and make it look a little bit more interesting. This is a good way to do that. If we zoom out, you'll see that the base map, which is the texture that is applied when we're zoomed far out from the terrain, works as expected, and that's because we changed the HDRP custom from hidden to custom at the dependency at the bottom of our shader. Hopefully you like this tutorial. I plan on making a few more. I think there will be another version of this for the URP, so look for that. If you like what you've seen here, go ahead and make a comment about it. Ask any questions. Tell me you like it. Give me a like, a thumbs up, whatever. And hopefully I'll see you in some more tutorials in the future. Take care.